Alright, guys, so the situation is critical and things are on fire. We have a real cloud of worry circling Europe and it's beginning to freak them out. Maybe the Americans won't save us at all, and the Russians are winning on the field, and we must talk about it because they're about to make a big economic gamble. We'll go through China's rejection of Ukraine and Europe's $100 billion plan to arm the entire continent. Plus, Germany is now demanding the US to cough out $60 billion for Ukraine. And if America doesn't, then the US is in big economic trouble, at least according to Berlin. The first news is Ukraine's foreign minister asking China to back their peace summit. During the Munich conference, he met with Wang Yi to push out a peace plan, and the idea is simple. Ukraine believes that China has enormous influence over Russia, and if Beijing tells Moscow to end the war tomorrow, it'll end in an instant. But to their horror, the exact opposite happened. China rejected the idea. China told him that it isn't the right time to talk about peace. Ukraine also wanted another peace summit in Switzerland, but China flat out dismissed it. And this is China witnessing the winds of change, and they want the conflict to play out. Remember that China pushed out their own 12-point peace plan in the past, but the West, as we all know, laughed at them. And we know that any summit today is probably just pushing a one-sided settlement. And here's what Wang Yi said. There are no ripe conditions in place for parties to go back to the negotiating table. He also emphasized that China isn't solely responsible for resolving the crisis, and this is quite a smart move. He's throwing the ball back to the West, he's absolving China of any blame shifting if things fall through. But let's dig a little deeper here. It's imperative we understand why China isn't on board with Ukraine's peace plan. If we look at the ground situation, Russia has made solid gains and they've captured the key town of Avdiivka. It's all over mainstream media today. For heaven's sake, it's on CNN. It's undeniable that the Russians aren't losing, but they are instead pressing ahead. They are capturing key fortifications and punching a hole in Ukraine's defenses. It's not a good look for the West, and Ukraine pressing China for peace plan now just doesn't make sense. Ukraine wants to use China to negotiate a Russian surrender when they are losing ground. It doesn't make any sense, and China obviously knows this. If Russia is collapsing like the West says, then why does China need to be involved? There are still headlines out there saying that Avdiivka holds little strategic advantage for Russia, and if that's the case, then there's no need to worry. So there's a serious disconnect between the narratives that aren't helping Ukraine at all. On one hand, the Russian military is collapsing, but on the other hand, there are calls daily for more aid, or else Putin will win. So it's one or the other, it can't possibly be both, which is the real story. Now, that's just a battle on the ground. The bigger issue here is China protecting their national interests, and that includes their economic trade and staying out of the crosshairs of the West. China and Russia trade has reached new records. They're essentially functioning as one unified economic unit. Beijing provides the finished products and goods and technology, while Russia supplies China with commodities including oil and gas. China-Russia trade has reached $240 billion in 2023 last year. It has grown by 26.3% a year earlier and surpassed even the bullish estimates from Putin. He expected only $200 billion, but it was $40 billion higher. Disrupting this trade with Russia for Ukraine isn't something that China places as a priority. Bilateral trade between both countries goes beyond just driving GDP growth. It's also about sanction-proofing themselves from the West. China's biggest weakness is the lack of domestic energy production for their industrial economy. Almost 40% of GDP comes from manufacturing, and if their supply gets cut away, China's economy will literally collapse. In 2023, Russia became China's top oil supplier. Beijing bought over 60 billion worth of oil from Moscow. Even though their supply is diversified globally, energy from Russia is still very vital. There's a reason why Russian supply has been increasing to China. It has overtaken Saudi Arabia by a solid 20 million tons last year. The first reason is because Russian crude is just next door. The Middle East and Asia Pacific, they have a big US military presence. The US Navy, in theory, can cut off China's energy supply, and that will threaten the entire Chinese economy. The second issue comes from the big discount China gets from the Russian supply. As we move towards a recession, price is everything. Cheaper energy equals more cost-effective manufacturing. That directly translates to capturing a bigger share of the market. Last year, China enjoyed a discount of at least 10% from Russian oil. At one point, the discount hit almost 20%. They bought above the price cap, but it was still significantly cheaper than the benchmark price. So you can understand the incentive China has to keep good relations with Russia. It is in their interest. Cheap energy is a big factor in why China can export deflation to the world, and is a key reason why industries from Europe are moving all the way to Beijing. One great example is how German industries are moving eastwards. Direct investment from German companies has reached a historic high of 12 billion euros into China. German companies are taking their profits and reinvesting them back into China. It's not rocket science. You can manufacture cheaply in China and sell directly to a market whose middle class is growing. Based on pure economics alone, China is benefiting from the conflict. There's no hurry to end the war on Ukraine's terms, especially when Russia isn't collapsing. And let's just assume China helps the West end the war tomorrow on their terms. What will happen? The Eye of Sauron will look east and China will be next on the line. So it makes no logical sense for China to facilitate any peace talks. The West wants Russia out completely, which means there's very little room for negotiations. So this economic war is only going to drag out. It will last for years, and Europe is beginning to realize that they could be left alone. NATO's already beginning to spend much more on defense because President Trump could be back in action. 2025 could be a year when Donald Trump comes back and Europe will be left to defend themselves. And let's talk about the big implications this will have because Europe is moving towards a full war economy mode. We've talked before about how defense spending can drive GDP. When you produce weapons, it does create economic growth. Not the best type of growth, but still growth nonetheless. And it seems Europe is about to take this to the next level, which is bonkers. According to Estonia, the Eurozone should sell joint bonds to boost EU defense spending. Europe has to do much more to deliver weapons to Ukraine as well. And this is how desperate the situation is getting. There are discussions of the EU issuing over $100 billion in Euro bonds to boost the continent's defense industry. Over 100 billion to build up their own military industrial complex. 100 billion is an enormous amount of money. But if Europe is to fully weaponize, that won't be nearly enough. The US spends around 3.5% of GDP on defense. That's over $800 billion. The biggest countries in Europe, including Italy, France, and Germany, fall far from even a 2% target. All the countries in red color aren't spending enough on defense yet. If the US were to pull out $100 billion in bonds, won't be nearly enough. The amount of debt they have to sell would be legendary. Germany themselves wants to raise defense spending to 3.5% of GDP, but finding the money is a big problem. And this is where we must talk about bonds for a bit. Issuing bonds to raise money is nothing new. Every country does that to raise funds to grow their economy. But issuing defense bonds is going to impoverish the EU even more. The first problem is borrowing at higher interest rates. The 10-year Eurozone yield has gone from negative to 3% in just 2 years. Europe has never borrowed money at such high yields before. If they really start borrowing $100 billion at 3%, this is going to keep interest rates higher for longer and push the EU further and further into debt. And when you issue bonds, you are removing capital from other productive parts of the economy as well. That is another problem that has consequences. Defense spending isn't productive. It's not like investing in farmland or energy production. It is not genuine economic growth, which means your output to pay back the debt will be compromised. And that will come back to bite the taxpayer down the road. To pay back the debt, either two things will eventually happen: money printing to inflate the debt away, or increasing taxes on workers and companies. And considering Europe already has the highest tax revenue as a percentage of their GDP, this is going to crush the economy even further. The majority of countries with the biggest tax burden are all within the Eurozone, well above the developed world average. Denmark and France are well above 40%. Even the US is ranked well below the EU at only 27%. That's why selling Euro bonds is a really risky idea. It could force the EU to raise taxes even further, which brings us to the big fear mongering coming out of Germany. And this is rather bizarre because it seems the Germans are the biggest cheerleaders for aid to Ukraine today. The German minister is warning America, telling them to cough out the money, that failure to back Ukraine could hurt the US economy. He is warning of economic Armageddon for America's defense contractors if US support doesn't come. Listen to this. We have signed hundreds of contracts worth billions of dollars, and we are about to prepare new contracts. The Alliance for Security brings many advantages for both sides. And if we read between the lines, this is a shocking maneuver by the Germans. It's a subtle warning to the US that if you don't play ball, we might not buy weapons from you in the future. There might not be new contracts for your defense industry. And you can literally sense the desperation in the air because Germany is in no position to warn the US of anything. The agenda here is to push for Ukraine aid now to get the 60 billion before it drags on and really becomes a campaign issue. If the aid for Ukraine stays in limbo until November, Trump will likely weaponize the issue for his campaign. Germany is pulling on all the levers to get the US to release the money now. In an interview, the defense minister Pistorius warned of the worst case scenario that the attack on NATO territory could happen in the next 5 to 8 years. So by 2032, the unthinkable could happen if Ukraine isn't defended. Now, the big worry Germany has is the war continuing for years because their economy is already collapsing. The contraction won't just stop in 2023, it will continue well into 2024 and even next year. Germany's Chambers of Industry and Commerce they've issued a big warning. Europe's biggest economy will shrink by 0.5% this year, the worst in over 2 decades. That is in addition to a GDP crash of 0.3% last year. The longer the conflict lasts, the deeper Germany's deindustrialization will be. But yet, they can't give Ukraine all the money to fight Russia because they have fiscal rules in place. German private consumption has suffered a loss in buying power. People are getting poorer. Their energy intensive sectors are also contracting because the cost of production is just too high. So the only hope left is the money from the US. Germany, they might be worried about Ukraine, but the biggest worry is for their own economy. In a sense, they are frustrated that the US is doing fine, but their own country is not. And to add insult to injury, German industries are fleeing to America as well. The exodus to China was bad enough, but companies are also heading to set up shop in the US. In a stunning report, German companies flocked to the US with record pledges of capital investment. Because the US economy is still standing and they are giving huge incentives, companies are running to America. The US is industrializing at the expense of Germany, and there's nothing Olaf Scholz can do about it except complaining or ending the war, right? And the only outcome they can consider is pushing the Russians out of Ukraine completely, which is highly unlikely. And this exodus of German companies to American soil has real consequences. In 2023, big German brands opened big projects in the US, and this includes Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Merck. Volkswagen alone saw an investment of $2 billion into America, and this created 4,000 jobs in the US, jobs that otherwise would have been created back in Germany. The longer this conflict continues, the more German companies will flee to the US. The more the industrial base of Germany will get hollowed out, they'll shrink, while it will grow in America. And it's important we understand this because it adds valuable context to the situation. We now understand why Germany is just so frustrated. Of all the parties outside of the war, they are the biggest losers, while the US, who's supposed to be their ally, is a very big winner. But let me know what you think. Will Germany's warning scare the US to give up the money? And did China make the right move to reject the peace talks from Ukraine? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.